Ever pondered the purpose of your existence? The question may seem cliché, but it's a timeless conundrum that has been haunting the corridors of human consciousness for millennia. Various philosophies and religions have tried to decipher this enigma, each presenting its own interpretation of life's purpose. Some propose that we're here to learn, to love, to grow, or perhaps to serve some divine intention, yet there exists an unconventional philosophical stance that challenges these traditional narratives. It's called antenatalism. This philosophy posits a rather unconventional perspective on life and its inherent value. Antenatalism asserts that human procreation may be considered unethical, and that the best way to prevent suffering could be not to bring new life into existence at all. It's a profound thought, isn't it? A perspective that certainly stirs the pot of conventional wisdom. So, what if the best way to prevent suffering is simply not to exist? Imagine a philosophy arguing that the most ethical approach to life is to avoid giving birth to it in the first place. This is antenatalism, a philosophy that might strike you as unusual, if not outright counterintuitive. But it's a perspective that's been gaining traction in philosophical circles. Antenatalism argues that human procreation is, in essence, unethical. Its proponents assert that by giving birth we subject a new being to the inevitable suffering that life entails. To them, the most compassionate decision is to spare potential lives this burden. This philosophy is not new, but its resurgence owes much to a South African philosopher named David Benatar. A prominent voice in contemporary philosophical discourse, Benatar has championed antenatalism, bringing it into the spotlight. He posits that the ultimate prevention of suffering isn't to alleviate it or to seek to overcome it, but rather to prevent existence itself. In his view, non-existence is a state free from any harm or suffering. After all, one cannot suffer if one does not exist. This might seem a drastic solution, but Benatar argues that it's the most effective way to prevent harm. But it's not just about preventing suffering. Antenatalism also raises questions about consent. Can an unborn being consent to its existence? If not, then is it not unethical to force existence upon it without its consent? This is a question that antenatalists take seriously, and it forms a crucial part of their argument. Antenatalism, then, offers a radically different perspective on life and ethics. It challenges our most fundamental assumptions about the value of existence and the ethics of procreation. It forces us to confront the possibility that the most compassionate act might be to refrain from bringing new life into a world filled with suffering. Truly, it proposes a radical way to prevent suffering, doesn't it? What if we told you that you never consented to be born? A jarring question, isn't it? It's the crux of the hypothetical consent argument, a cornerstone of antenatalist philosophy. At its core, this argument grapples with the idea of consent, a fundamental principle in ethics. Consent implies agreement or permission. In most areas of life, we recognize the importance of consent. But when it comes to existence, it appears we lose sight of this principle. Antenatalists argue that potential beings, the unborn, cannot give consent to their own existence. They cannot agree or disagree with being thrust into a world filled with suffering and pain, joy and pleasure, love and hate. They cannot voice their opinion on whether they want to embark on the roller coaster ride of life. This lack of consent, according to antenatalists, makes procreation inherently unethical. It's a violation of the rights of the unborn. It's a decision made without consulting the party most affected by it. This is akin to making a life-altering decision on someone else's behalf, without their input or approval. It's a bold act, one that assumes knowledge of the unborn's preferences and desires, which is impossible to truly know. You might argue, but the unborn can't give consent because they don't exist yet. And you'd be correct. But this is precisely the point antenatalists are making. The inability of the unborn to provide consent is a crucial part of their argument. It's not about the practicality of seeking consent from the non-existent, but rather, it's about the ethical implications of making a decision that will inevitably result in a sentient being's existence, with all its potential for suffering and joy, without their consent. In essence, the hypothetical consent argument challenges us to reevaluate our understanding of ethics as it pertains to procreation. It asks us to consider the ethics of imposing life, with all its inherent uncertainties and complexities, on an entity incapable of giving consent. The unborn, thus, are forced into existence without their consent. Ever heard of The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky? This novel, a classic of Russian literature, presents an ideological clash that echoes the sentiments of antenatalism. Let's dive into it. In this monumental work, Dostoevsky draws us into the world of Ivan and Aloysia Karamazov, two brothers who wrestle with profound philosophical and ethical issues. They embody the eternal debate between faith and reason, between acceptance and rebellion. Ivan, the intellectual, is plagued by the problem of evil and suffering. He questions the existence of a benevolent God in a world filled with unspeakable pain. In one of the novel's most poignant exchanges, Ivan asks his deeply religious brother Aloysia, "Imagine that you are creating a fabric of human destiny with the object of making men happy in the end, but that it was essential and inevitable to torture to death only one tiny creature, and to found that edifice on its unavenged tears. Would you consent to be the architect on those conditions?" Ivan's question confronts us with the moral implications of creating life. It mirrors the antenatalist argument, suggesting that being born, and thus being exposed to the possibility of suffering, is non-consensual and potentially unethical. Aloysia, on the other hand, embodies faith and compassion. He maintains that human suffering, while tragic, is not a sufficient reason to negate life's potential for goodness and joy. He argues that love and kindness can redeem even the most profound suffering. This perspective challenges Ivan's, and by extension, the antenatalist view. Through Ivan and Aloysia, Dostoevsky explores the tension between two opposing worldviews. He invites us to reflect on the ethical implications of birth and the inherent potential for suffering that comes with existence. It's a debate that continues to be relevant, challenging us to ponder the ethical dimensions of life and existence. Ivan's argument, in essence, echoes the sentiment of antenatalism. Scene script. Life is a game, but what if you never asked to play? This question invites us to reflect on the essence of existence. It's like being thrown into an ongoing match without knowing the rules, the players, or even the purpose of the game itself. The existentialist would argue that life's meaning, its purpose, and its value are things we must figure out for ourselves. Consider the concept of energy continuity. From a scientific standpoint, energy is neither created nor destroyed. It merely changes form. We as humans are energy encapsulated in physical bodies. We eat food for fuel, we burn calories for warmth, we exert effort to move, and when our bodies cease to function, the energy within us doesn't disappear. It's transformed, released back into the universe. In this sense, our existence transcends our physical bodies. We are part of a grand, continuous cycle of energy that's been going on for billions of years. Now, let's look at life as a game. Games have rules, players, objectives, and consequences. But unlike conventional games, life doesn't come with a manual. We're not even sure what the objective is. Is it to accumulate wealth, to find love, to achieve happiness, or simply to survive? The rules seem arbitrary, the players unpredictable, and the consequences often disproportionate. Yet we continue to play, making choices every day that shape our reality and impact our well-being. The choices we make, big or small, have profound effects on our happiness. Choosing a career, a partner, a place to live, or even what to eat for dinner can make us happy or miserable. The freedom to make these choices is both a privilege and a burden. We're responsible for our actions and their consequences, but we're also empowered to shape our destiny. In the end, is the game of life one that's worth playing, or is the antenatalist view more compelling? So, what have we unraveled about the philosophy of antenatalism today? We've delved into the compelling argument that human procreation may be deemed unethical, as it introduces a life into a world of inevitable suffering. Propelled into the spotlight by South African philosopher David Benatar, antenatalism suggests that non-existence is the only surefire way to prevent suffering. Within this framework, we've explored the hypothetical consent argument, which posits that the unborn cannot give consent to being born, making procreation non-consensual and thus unethical. We've also navigated the ideological clash in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, where the problem of evil and suffering takes center stage. Lastly, we touched upon existential reflections, pondering concepts like the continuity of energy, life as a game, and the weight our choices carry on our well-being and happiness. Does the philosophy of antenatalism challenge your perspective on existence? Remember, the purpose of philosophy is not to persuade, but to provoke thought and conversation.